Christine Schneider, the Visceral Voice.
Welcome to the Visceral Voice podcast. I'm your host, Christine Schneider. Through this podcast, I aim to bring you the most current, up-to-date research on voice science, function, pain science, movement, and everything in between. I am on a quest to learn everything I can about the living, breathing body and its intricate connection to the voice. This podcast documents the continuation of my learning and my experience as a professional singer, a nutritional consultant, a movement specialist, and a manual therapist. Join us as we strive to provide current, knowledgeable, creative, and compassionate information to help you restore, regain, and create happiness and success on your vocal journey. Phil Doucette is a member of the voice care team at Philadelphia Ear, Nose, and Throat Associates. He is a licensed speech-language pathologist and a singing voice specialist. His interest in voice has taken him down many paths as a performer, collaborator, teacher, conductor, researcher, and clinician. As a performer and artistic collaborator, he has extensive professional experience in a variety of styles, including opera, oratorio, operetta, choral, music theater, folk, rock and pop, and jazz, as well as non-Western traditions, including classical Arabic and Indian, Hindustani and Carnatic song. Phil is an active choral conductor, serving as the Associate Director of the Wilmington Children's Chorus since 2009. He is also Associate Conductor of the Thomas Jefferson University Choir. He has been a featured presenter on issues relating to testosterone-dominant voice change at Regional American Choral Directors Association events, and has been a presenter lecturer at several colleges and universities on a variety of issues, including voice health and pedagogy, as well as care for the high-performance voice user. He also serves on the editorial board of the Journal of Voice. Phil holds a Master of Music in Voice Performance and Pedagogy from the Pennsylvania State University and a Master of Arts in Speech-Language Pathology from Westchester University. He is a member of the National Association of Teachers of Singing, the Voice Foundation, the American Speech and Hearing Association, the American Guild of Musical Artists, and the American Choral Directors Association. I am so excited to talk to Phil today. We have emailed actually for years, and then I finally got to meet him this year in Philadelphia at the Voice Foundation, so that was really exciting. And you will hear, if you don't know Phil, he's just a ton of fun. So I hope you enjoy this episode with Phil Doucette. Phil Doucette, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Yay, I'm so excited to have you here. We have emailed actually back and forth for a couple years. I remember a couple years ago we were emailing each other, and I was so excited. And then we finally met this year in Philadelphia at the Voice Foundation.
Yep.
And I was so excited to actually finally meet you. And then I convinced you to come on and talk with me on the podcast. So thank you for being here.
Oh, it's an absolute honor. I've been a fan of the work that you've been doing for so many years now, and we've actually kind of gotten to know each other a little bit through some of the individuals that we've worked with as well.
Mm-hmm.
I've often had people that I've recommended to go work with you, or I've worked with them and I've mentioned your name and they've said, well, I've actually done a couple sessions with her. So I kind of feel like before we got to meet each other, I already got to kind of know you through your work and through what you're putting kind of out there in the world. And I'm just thrilled to be a part of it. So thank you so much for inviting me.
Oh yeah, my pleasure. So I would love to start today by just talking a little bit about your journey into becoming a speech language pathologist as well as a singing voice specialist.
Sure. Well, I think like a lot of people, you go to school, you have these dreams, you have these ideas, you have these plans, and then life happens, right? So I got a voice performance degree. Plan A, even though I didn't tell my voice teacher, was to be a rock star. But, that wasn't quite panning out. But all along the way, I became really, really fascinated with how the voice worked. And that led me to getting a voice performance and pedagogy degree from Penn State. Still had this idea in the back of my head I was going to be the next Bono. But in the meantime, was just falling more and more in love with teaching voice, and also realizing how helping other people find their voices was scratching an itch that I didn't even know that I had. And I guess I've always had a part of me that really feels like a helper and really wants to be part of a team. And so seeing that I could use those own skills as a way to help others find their own voice just became something I kept leaning more and more into. So, I finished my master's, and I think this will sound familiar to a lot of folks. I had 2 degrees, but I didn't really know how to sing yet. And along the way, I met someone who is now the love of my life, my wife and collaborator in a lot of different projects I do, Kim. And we moved to Delaware so that she could get her master's. And I just started doing the freelancing thing. Opened up a voice studio, was doing a lot of pickup work. I was doing ensemble work, solo work, writing in bands, doing a lot of the DIY stuff, playing clubs, coffee houses, you name it. And after a while, I kind of was like, this isn't working, right? I had to call it. I had to make a change. And it was a really, really tough choice to make. But I think all of us sometimes reach that point where we go, okay, I've done the 5-year plan for 10 years. What am I going to do next? And again, all that time, finding that way to use the skills that I had learned, the instincts that I had to help other people, that kept being the thing I kept coming back to. And that's what led me to go back and get my degree at Westchester for speech pathology, communication disorders. I was very lucky to work with Liz Grillo while I was there, who was also a singer. She went to Indiana, and she was just a wonderful mentor for me about what might be possible. So then jump cut to the end of that degree, I started working in a hospital, and I was like a general speech path where I was spending my days working with people recovering from stroke, recovering from trauma, all kinds of things, doing really the work of what we would consider to be a traditional medical adult SLP, swallowing, language, cognition, some voice. But at that point, still, the voice rehabilitation or the voice work that I was doing was still primarily as a voice teacher and as a choral director. I had started working with this project in Wilmington called the Wilmington Children's Chorus. And that's when I was starting to really see this intersection of not only voice pedagogy, but also figuring out how to apply a voice first concept in larger groups and with younger people at different stages of their development. Right. And then after about 5-6 years of working in the hospitals, along the way, I had developed a bit of a professional relationship with Peggy Baruti, one of the giants in the singing voice specialist and rehabilitation field. And one day she called me up and she said, Phil, I'm going to be retiring from Dr. Sadilov's office. And I said, hey, congratulations. It's wonderful. I wish you the best of luck. And she said, I want you to apply for the job. And I dropped the phone. I was like, surely this is a joke. But I went in, I interviewed, I observed with her, and I was fortunate enough to get the opportunity. And when you look at a lot of the writing that's out there and the discussions out there about what is it to be a singing voice specialist, this intersection of being a voice teacher, of being someone who has professional singing experience, and then who also has this additional training in rehabilitation practices, medical terminology, standards of care in injury recovery. All of those things were on my CV. It's just, it wasn't one of those things that when I went into my undergrad, I said, right, I'm going to become a singing voice specialist. So the way that I got here was maybe a little bit unplanned, but when I look at it in hindsight, it really kind of looks like I was putting that toolkit together really from day one, even though that wasn't always my intention. So, and that's
How
how I got here.
when did you start at the Philadelphia Eye and Ear?
I've been there almost 5 years now.
5 years.
So
Okay.
yeah, like 2018, 2019 is when I started observing. I was kind of wrapping up and doing per diem work at the hospital that I was working at. Did a lot of intensive observation and side-by-side work with Peggy, and then moved on from there. Yeah, so that was 2019. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. So you have mentioned singing voice specialist, and you are both a singing voice specialist and a speech language pathologist, so a speech therapist for some of the listeners who might not know what that is. So there are a lot of terms out there being used now for voice teachers. So we have speech language pathologists and voice teachers. They are different. And we also have singing voice specialists, so SVS. We also have vocologists. We also have people who say that they specialize in pedagogy, whether that's classical pedagogy or music theater pedagogy or whatever the pedagogy is. They have learned how to teach something. So can
and then
we
good old-fashioned voice teachers
and a good old-fashioned voice teacher. Can we just kind of run down maybe the differences in integration of each of these?
Sure. And not to give people some required reading or required listening, but I think something that will really help people kind of backfill a little bit of this conversation. In June of 2021, you had Jenna Battaglia on your series, and in February of 2022, you had Wendy Laborn, and I think both of them speak so eloquently about evidence-based practice in voice teaching and how that informs being a vocologist, being a voice teacher. And Jenna does a great job in talking you from like speech path, what is it 101 on forward. So I'm going to assume or encourage folks go and listen to those to give you a little bit of background. But what I would say is, the main difference between being a singing voice specialist and being a speech language pathologist is the training and then the certification. So being a speech language pathologist, it's something you go to school for, something you get a degree in, something that you do then a clinical fellowship year for. And
you're a licensed practitioner.
And you become licensed not only by ASHA, the American Speech and Hearing Association, but also in the state that you practice. And as I found out during COVID, the state that your patient lives in. So I actually hold a couple of different state licenses in addition to my ASHA numbers or my ASHA license. Being a singing voice specialist is a little bit more like being a voice teacher, right? In that there is no accreditation per se. There is no diploma required. There's no licensure required. I think that in the future, we will see the profession move more in that direction. But for right now, people come into this role in many, many different ways. And for people who are looking for a little bit more about what is required to become a singing voice specialist, I think I'd refer them to a couple of things. There's a great book by Alita Scarce that she published back in 2016 called The Manual of Singing Voice Rehabilitation. But I'd also encourage folks to go to the Voice Foundation website. And what they do is they kind of describe what a singing voice specialist with ideal training has. And so I'm going to kind of paraphrase from that a little bit. It starts by saying the singing voice specialist is a singing teacher with special training equipping them to practice in a medical environment with patients who have sustained vocal injury. Most singing voice specialists have a degree in voice performance or pedagogy. Some have extensive performing and teaching experience without a formal academic degree. Nearly all have professional performance experience as well as extra training in laryngeal anatomy, neuroanatomy of the voice, physiology of phonation, training in the rehabilitation of injured voices and other specialized areas. Singing voice specialists who become certified licensed speech language pathologists, that is becoming more the norm. This is optimal provided that the speech language pathologist has sufficient experience and training not only as a performing artist, but also as a teacher of singing. So, and I really do kind of support, I nod my head when I read that definition. It is a voice teacher who has special training in rehabilitation.
Mm-hmm.
There are young people that I meet who are currently pursuing a speech language pathology degree who maybe don't have the professional performing experience, don't have the experience of teaching voice, but maybe have taken some voice lessons themselves or enjoy singing. And they say, so is that something I'll be able to do once I get my certification? And I say, no, it's not quite as simple as that, because
Mm-hmm.
it really does come down to lived experience in addition to that specialized education, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the people who seem to be working in the field right now.
Yeah, that's excellent. That's actually, years ago, I can't remember if I've talked about this on the podcast before, but years ago, I was talking to my dear friend, Tom Burke, and
Mm-hmm.
I said, gosh, this was, I don't know, I was probably 5 or 6 years into my private practice. And I said, I really feel like I should become a speech language pathologist too. I think that would really help. And Tom said, there are so many classes in there that you would have no interest in because it has nothing to do with the work that you're doing. And
Mm-hmm.
so now I'm hearing singing voice specialist and I'm like, oh, this is what this is what I should add on. I should be a singing voice specialist.
Yeah, and so I would add to that the scope of practice of a speech language pathologist is indeed very, very wide. But like
Mhm.
Wendy said on the podcast back in 2022, there's a difference between scope of practice and scope of
Mhm.
expertise.
Yeah.
Right. So when I got my degree, the scope of practice said that I could push into audiology. I could work in pediatrics. I could go into a school setting. And I am here to tell you that if any of those folks were to walk through my door right now, I would run screaming in the opposite direction.
Mhm.
Because yes, it's in my scope of practice, but it's not in my scope of expertise. And
Mhm.
so I would have an ethical responsibility to say to that individual, look, you need to go to one of my colleagues who has expertise in this. And so as we talk about this intersection of voice therapy, speech therapy, voice instruction, I think that is one of the things that I think can help really inform the decision making of a person if they're working, if they have the opportunity to work with an injured singer. Is this in my scope of expertise?
Mhm.
And how do I create the experiences and the education that brings that into my scope of expertise if that is in fact something I want to do?
Yeah. Sure. And so what would be the differences between I mean, I think you've already hit on several of them, but what would
Mhm.
be the difference between a singing voice specialist and a vocalogist?
Well, I think that when we talk, when you look at what's been kind of written, recorded, discussed so far, there's a lot of talk about the concept of a difference between habilitation and
Mhm.
rehabilitation, right? And here I'm paraphrasing Ingo Tietze's definitions. Habilitation is the process of training, strengthening the healthy voice to meet a performance demand, whereas rehabilitation is restoring a voice to its former condition and or function, right?
Mhm.
And I would say that the primary responsibility of a singing voice specialist is that of rehabilitation. We are helping someone put together the pieces after they have suffered some kind of vocal injury. Whereas a vocalogist, that might not be something that they're really charged with.
Mhm.
Um, and again, one of the things that I like to say to folks when they meet me for the first time, and again, I kind of word this a little bit differently depending on who I'm working with. As a rehabilitationist, I have the luxury of not really caring how you sound.
Mhm.
My first responsibility to you is, how does it feel?
Mhm.
How does it function? And sometimes when we get you to a place of intact function, when you're recovering from an injury, you actually sound rather alarming.
Mhm.
And if that were to happen in a voice studio or in a coaching studio, and we heard that, we would think, oh my gosh, I need to fix that, or else that person's not going to get hired, or they're not going to get hired again.
Mhm.
Right. And so I think this where aesthetics sit in the toolkit are a little bit different when you're doing rehabilitation versus working with a healthy voice.
Sure. Well, and we all know that there's sort of this middle ground
Hmm.
between rehabilitation and habilitation. So we were talking before we got on to record today, and in manual therapy, we have someone gets some kind of injury and they
Hmm.
see a physical therapist for rehabilitation,
Hmm.
and then they go through their 12 or 16 or 18 visits, and
Hmm.
then they're dismissed and they're kind of confused. They're not entirely sure where to go. Maybe they still
Right.
have some symptoms, so they're actually still experiencing some discomfort. Maybe the pain is better, but it's certainly not gone.
Yeah.
There are still certain movement patterns that
Hmm.
haven't been successful,
Yeah.
and they're still in those unsuccessful movement patterns.
100%.
And then they'll maybe start going to the gym and working with a personal trainer. And sometimes with certain levels of personal training, they don't have the education to help in that middle ground of where someone's been when they were in an acute injury, and
Hmm.
then but they're still not actually to the level of habilitation. So
Right.
in the world of strength and conditioning, and in movement practices, we now have a movement specialist, we have
Hmm.
corrective exercise specialist, we have biomechanics specialist, I have all of my training in all of those areas,
Hmm.
because I do work in rehabilitation in my work.
Hmm.
But then it's also a matter of, okay, but then how can we get someone? I was curious because I was helping with rehabilitation, but I
Hmm.
only had an hour with someone per week.
Hmm.
So then I started thinking, but if I could assist with their movement and they could go home and
Hmm.
have exercises to do, drills to do at home, how much faster could their rehabilitation be to really get them back to an optimal place with their movement? And of course, because I'm working with the voice, with their performance.
Right.
So, where's that kind of middle ground?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I sometimes describe that as like the tidewaters, right? I live in Wilmington, and so like the Delaware is not too far from here, and there are parts of the Delaware which, when you go swimming, you think you're in the ocean because the water is really salty,
Mm,
and then you go a couple miles up or up towards New Hope in Pennsylvania, and it's fresh water, and there's this area in between. These tidewaters are a little bit brackish, right? It's not clear, and I think that in many ways, a role like there is a moment where it's no longer clear cut. This is voice therapy, which clearly belongs in the circle, in the water, in the headwaters of being an SLP. And this isn't open ocean. This isn't a voice teacher, a style specific coach, a style specific pedagogue. It's a hybrid,
mhm.
and in Lita's book, she talks about this. And there's also a great Nats chat that happened. I think it was last April in two parts. Kari Reagan, Marcy Rosenberg, Peggy Baruti, and Lita were part of it. And I mean, talk about listening to a round table of giants talking about
Yeah.
where it's been and where it's going. I really recommend that people take the time to listen to that as well, regardless of whether you're interested in being an SVS or not, because I think it really helps you get a better sense of these tidewaters that you're talking about. Where does therapy end, and where does learning begin? And there are a lot of different opinions about that. And I think in my own experience, and I think every therapist has to draw that line a little bit differently. But I one of the things that my first 5 years of being a speech path in a hospital taught me, especially when I was working with folks recovering from stroke, is that when healing ends, relearning
Mm,
begins, right? And it's real clear cut when you're in that acute phase and you're talking about active healing. And
mhm.
there is a role for the singing voice specialist to be working alongside a speech path in close collaboration, because you should always be part of a team, right? And you should really have open communication with the ENT, who is really the person who's organizing this individual's care. The individual is the boss, but we're all a team working in concert to help that individual. And then as that acute healing calms down and things start to physically stabilize, there is a period, like you said, where you have to relearn. There were compensations that were happening to help you cope with the injury before it was addressed, that need to be seen for what they are, deconstructed, and then replaced with more healthy habits. And sometimes that happens in a space where you are simply spending an hour working on how getting from scale degree 1 to scale degree 2 on an ah. And it's rare to find a voice teacher who feels like they can do that, because the expectation a lot of times in voice lessons is, all right, now how do I apply this to the repertoire that you're then going to be turning around and sharing with your public? So this is a place where the private work can happen with very little of that pressure. And so sometimes the journey that I take with an individual starts with them in the exam room, where I'm side by side with the speech path, with the otolaryngologist, with that individual and their family. And it ends with me pushing into voice lessons with the teacher that they're returning to, or the new teacher that we've discovered is maybe the person they should be working with if they didn't have a voice teacher before, or if the learning that they've been doing has been more in group instruction, either through like an ensemble director, a band director, what have you, and getting them with some guidance where they can swim out in that open ocean without us being there. And that's a lot of gray area.
Yeah. Yeah. You had mentioned a word, and I had talked a little bit about this in the last episode with Matt Cahill. But I do just want to say to the listeners, we hear the word compensation and we often think of it in a negative way, but compensation our body is absolutely brilliant, and our body will find a way to move through space.
Oh, yeah.
And it is always looking for a way to continue on, to survive. And so it's brilliant because it knows how to compensate. And many times it compensates for a certain amount of time. And then we're actually moving out of those compensations and we're back to actually being able to continue with movement.
Right.
Sometimes, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say sometimes those compensations are like brainstem level reaction to the catalyst that's happening in the moment, right? And then sometimes those are echoes of past motor memory, right? And learning how to discern between those two. Again, thanks to your podcast, I was introduced to the work of Andrew Byrne. And one of the things that through reading his book and learning a little bit about his approach to voice teaching, one of the things that I find myself sometimes saying to the singers that I work with is the brainstem will always win. And the language center likes to think it's the boss, but it's not. Right. And so we have this one small part of the brain that judges us, that talks at us, that tells us about the technique. But that's not really the part that's singing. When we're on stage and we're in a role, or we're on stage in front of 20,000 people, we are not thinking, we don't always have the luxury of thinking, lift the soft palate, like adjust, right? Like we're just in the moment and we go, we're in that flow state. That's the brainstem. That's the middle brain. That's the lower brain. And so making a person aware of how much that's in charge and seeing if we can guide it and influence it, just like we can influence eye blink, heartbeat, breathing. So much of singing is more of that suggestive in steering, as opposed to take these orders from my language center and now go do it, dot the I's and cross the T's, right? When we then put a person in an injured context, it's not only get the brainstem influenced, but get the brainstem stopping the reaction to maybe what it sees as a threat to the airway, or what you see as a threat to your identity and your existence. These are really, 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 really strong currents that we're swimming against. And it takes time, and it takes support, and it takes time for the person to not only unpack that physically, but also emotionally as well. And that's another big part of what we have to do as a singing voice specialist.
I love that you said that so much. The brainstem will always win. A lot of times when we talk about our center of mass, technically at L4, L5, L5, S1. But a lot of times when I'm teaching, I'll mention that we're working here to stabilize around our center of mass. And then I'll place my hands right here under my ear, right behind my mandible. And I'll say, and this is our center of mass.
Yeah.
Our brainstem is also our center of mass.
Yeah.
So I love that you just integrated that.
Yeah. When Andrew talks about like the look behind, right? When I've kind of adopted that into my own practice, it's something I'll often do with singers when I first start working with them. I say, we're going to work. We're not going to war. And I will sometimes, just to keep the mood light, I will say, look behind you, see that there are no bears there. Now look behind the other shoulder and see there are no bears there. Now let's go to work. Because again, the brainstem thinks everything is life and death, you know? And again, when Peggy Baruti and Dr. Sadaloff, I think, say it best when they say, when you're working with a singer who's been injured, the biggest nightmare that they could imagine has happened, right? It is a diagnosis that is as serious as cancer. And when you talk about feeling under threat, it's not only a professional threat, but your very identity feels like it's at stake. And that injury of confidence, which Lita talks about, is every bit as important as the physical injury that you're helping them overcome. And they need to walk side by side in the process.
Yes, that is such an important component. And I've seen, obviously, many of my clients in that state, and how they get back to a point where they can go back to being that elite performer in a lead of a Broadway show. And it can be, it's a journey, and it definitely takes a team of support to help them get into a mental state to be able to go back and trust that they're in a space that they can do it without getting injured again.
Yeah, it's the blessing and the curse of patient-centered care, right? Like we talk about this notion that we are a team, the patient is the boss, right? We are all there to give a patient options, give them support, give them tools to heal and to recover. But they are ultimately the one that determines which path they take in that path of recovery, how long they walk down that path. And we give them guidance as best as we ethically can, as compassionately as we can, as professionally as we can. But when you have that injury of confidence, how do you find the courage to walk down that path? How do you find the courage to take which path to take? Some of that happens, you know, in a therapy room with a specialist. Some of that also needs to happen in a room with a behavior specialist or a counselor, because those are the folks who really have the training to get down to the core of that. But we also can't ignore that that's part of what they bring into the room. And it's our responsibility as good clinicians, I think, to be aware of that and to educate ourselves with some tools that we can use to assist them when they're in those moments, even if that's referral to another specialist.
Yeah, I would just say, if anyone is hearing this and this sounds like where you are, I tell my clients all the time, I will always lead from a space of hope. And that is what I have at the foundation of everything that I do. And so there, you know, I can't say percentages, but a very, very high percentage of folks get back into it, and you can do it too.
Yeah. And I think one of the things, you know, talking to folks who find themselves in that space, but also talking to folks who are in the rehabilitation space, as the clinician, right? One of the most important things that I have learned is that helping isn't always fixing, right? And what recovery looks like isn't always getting back to who you were. Right. In fact, that should actually be a little bit of a red flag when someone says, all I want to do is be who I was before the injury. Whoa, we need to have a talk, right? Because even if you hadn't been injured, the person who you are a year from now is not the person who you are right now. right?
Absolutely.
And we need to try to have a clear picture or an open mind of what success looks like, because success might be reinvention, success might be redefining, success might be good as new or better than new, but that's not always the case. And if it's not that, that's not a failure. That's just an evolution of who you are as an artist. And I think that's a very important conversation for us to have, not only as the individual who's working through that recovery, but as the person who's trying to help facilitate that healing and that journey.
Yeah. Thank you so much for saying all of that, Phil. It's so important. So I'd like to transition now
Oh, sure.
into your work with the children's chorus.
Sure.
So again, we've talked briefly about, I know I was not in a children's chorus. I
Mhm.
don't have any firsthand experience, but I
Mhm.
do have a number of friends
Mhm.
that had a really hard time transitioning from working as a young singer in a
Mhm.
children's chorus
Mhm.
and then transitioning into, and of course I was in the field of music theater, so I'm talking about music theater artists, but that could be anything, whether they want to transition into pop, whether they want to transition into opera, whatever it might be,
Mhm.
because when I was growing up, we were still in the time frame of the idea of kind of the Vienna Boy Choir.
Mhm. Mhm.
So you
It.
are the director of a children's chorus.
Well, let me back up a little bit, because I just want to kind of yes and what you were talking about, because I think you and I are of almost a similar generation, and I'm kind of reminded of that joke of like a person gets up to heaven and St. Peter says, okay, well, let's go through this room. And this is the room where all the people who believe in this religion are, and they're having a great time. And then you go to another door and they go, okay, well, here's all the people who believe in this religion and they're having a great time. And then he says, all right, well, we need to be really quiet as we go by the next room because these people think they're the only ones who belong here. Right. And I think I jokingly think, hey, that really describes the landscape of vocal pedagogy that I grew up in.
Mm.
Right. Where when you went to voice lessons, when you went into a choir space, a lot of times there was this idea that vocal technique was quote unquote classical, and it was for unamplified voices. And when you would ask for guidance about other things, a lot of times the answer that you would get from that teacher is, I don't have a lot of experience in that, so I don't want to quote unquote hurt you, so we won't talk about it at all.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So unamplified classical singing is the only thing that belongs in heaven, just to draw the line to that tangential joke, right? So I think a lot of us who came up in that environment where we felt a little bit left to our own devices, as we've become teachers, we realize that was a real hole in our instruction.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when we look at the reality of how many minutes are people spending performing unamplified versus amplified music in our culture, what kind of music are they going to be interacting with in the real world when they leave school or they leave the studio? And I think a lot of us collectively realized we had some work that we needed to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so models are changing. You see this at the collegiate level. A lot of music schools are starting to pivot away from exclusively teaching a Western European conservatory model of training and are moving towards that. And you're starting to see that trickle down, I think, into choir programs of all stripes, whether it be school-based programs in high schools and children's choruses, right? So yes, I do appreciate the fact that a lot of times when people hear children's chorus, where they think about children's chorus training, they hearken back to Vienna Boy Choir,
Mm-hmm.
straight tone, a whole nine, blending, right? Kind of whittling the voice down to become part of this homogenized sound. But there are a number of organizations out there, a couple that I would specifically encourage people to listen to: Uniting Voices of Chicago, the Young People's Chorus of New York. These are folks who I think are creating a new template of what it is to be in a quote unquote youth choir or a community organization that revolves around the training of music. And the group that I work with, the Wilmington Children's Chorus, we consciously or not, kind of have adopted that model as well. We look at music as something that kids can be really passionate about, and that can create a certain degree of motivation to learn other things, the power of commitment, the power of working on a team, how personal empowerment allows you to become a stronger part of your community. And so, and also that music can be fun, but it can also be a disciplined study. And my wife Kim and I, my wife is the artistic director of the children's chorus, and so we're colleagues in that regard as well. Because of both of us having a voice background and us both coming from being voice teachers and being soloists, we remember that conflict of like wanting to develop our voice as a soloist, but then feeling how that didn't quite fit in an ensemble situation, whether it be in college, whether it be in high school, whether it be professionally. And as we have had this opportunity to kind of make this children's chorus in the image that we want it to be, we made a decision that we wanted it to be voice first and focus on vocal development, but from an individual perspective first, so that your voice matters, your voice devoid of style. How do you healthily start your sound? How do you healthily stop your sound? How do you get louder? How do you get quieter? How do you sing higher? How do you sing lower in a way where it's working efficiently rather than you're like straining at the expense of the music? And so to that end, a lot of the repertoire we do, it really runs the gamut. Sometimes it's songs in unison. Sometimes it's pop music. Sometimes it's musical theater, folk song. Sometimes it's from the traditional choral canon. But yeah, it's a little bit evolved from that idea of it being 4-part harmony, kind of emulating what was going on back in the 16 and 1700s.
Do you think genre of music influences that, or
Yeah,
those challenges?
100%. I think as humans, we learn by mimicking, right? And so we can't help but hear a recording of Adele or hear a recording of Pavarotti or insert any person here. And when we are and if we are inspired by that and we say, hey, I like that, I want to do that, somewhere along the line we can't help but mimic that. Right. And whether we realize it or not, we're bringing the stylistic expectation along for the ride as we're figuring out how we make our voice go. And so, you can address that in one of two ways. I think in vocalizing itself, you have the luxury of just stripping it down to the quality of the pitch, the quality of the vowel, the quality of the loudness, and how you move from pitch to pitch. But by then doing a variety of different styles of music, you can say, so the stylistic expectation for this piece of music is a vowel that maybe is a little bit more like the way we speak. The expectation for this music is a vowel that will work in context with all of these other voices to create more of a vertical soundscape, right? And how you talk about that with 8-year-olds is very different from how you talk about that with 16-year-olds. But I do think you can have those conversations and teach kids how to move in those different spaces.
And you actually teach both, correct?
Yeah.
So what are the
Yeah.
ages of each of the choral groups that you work with?
Sure. So the Wilmington Children's Chorus specifically, we've just started an expansion where we're working with kids from ages 1 through 16, right? We have an early learners program where it's music exposure, like Mozart and Mommy kind of stuff. When if you're like, for those of you who are trying to get a conception of this, where we have a music teacher who's exposing kids to things like different tonalities, steady beat, etc. And then we have these kids starting to make music in a very play-based way, starting at ages like 4 and 5, right? But then our performing choirs start at around ages 7 and 8. And I think there are so many ways that we define that, right? And whenever you're working with a performing ensemble, whether you're a music director for a school musical or a chorus, a church choir, a voice studio, we're always balancing this aesthetic expectation. Can you do the thing the composer put on the paper versus can you do it yet? And what is the most honest and healthful way that your body can produce that right now?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that is a million miles away from the original broadcast recording or the Deutsche Grammophon recording. And we, as the vocal mentor, need to be there saying, that is okay.
Mm-hmm.
You are on a journey. You are not yet 40. You are not at the height of your career. All of the, you are not, you are not post-production of a recording studio, which is an amalgam of 60 takes and auto-tune and every kind of airbrushing the technology can bring to bear.
Mm-hmm.
You are a human being figuring out how to become skilled.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to embrace those flaws and be patient with those flaws and let them become more refined.
Mm-hmm.
And that is one of the reasons why I think I'm so passionate about working with young people and working with people through this children's chorus model, because I think that on one hand, I'm helping them figure out who they are in an empowered way where they get to define what that empowerment is. But also as a therapist, I'm doing a lot of preventative care
Mm-hmm.
because I'm teaching them how to value, does this feel like it's being produced easily? And what does it feel like when it's not? So that they can actually sound that alarm and figure out how to talk about it if they're in another music making situation, or if we're in production week for one of our concerts and they're like, Mr. Phil, something feels a little bit off. And I'm like, well, let's talk about that,
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, I know. When we had chatted at the conference and I heard that you worked with children's chorus, I knew that I wanted to bring it up on the podcast because the fact that you're a speech language pathologist and a singing voice specialist working with children was, I think, so intriguing to me. And I just wanted people to hear that I know that there are so many other people out there who are directors of children's chorus, and being able to have you as a reference, maybe even being able to reach out to you in guidance of how to speak to the singers so that we aren't being anyone who makes them feel like that they're in a room with the color paint on the wall and that they can't do something.
Yeah, I don't want to meet them in my office when they're 60 saying I can't sing.
Yeah.
But it's funny because in a way that kind of circles back to my origin story, right? That was not part of my plan when I set out on this journey. I discovered that I had a gift for singing in a high school choir, right? I loved to sing. I jokingly say that, my parents weren't great singers, but they loved to sing. So the greatest gift they gave me was, not being afraid to open my mouth and holler. But it really wasn't until high school that I realized that I had a knack for this. And so there was a time when I thought, right, I'm just going to become a high school choir director. Like I think a lot of people, you emulate what you want to be based on what you're around. And when I first started working with the children's chorus, it was kind of a side hustle for me when I was a freelance singer and voice teacher. The person who I was studying with at the time was starting this project. He brought Kim in because he knew that Kim had an education degree and she had a comfort in working with younger singers. And they needed someone to manage the choir, to kind of be the buffer between the parents and the artistic staff and, pull out the folding chairs and what have you. And then a couple of years later, some of our trebles' voices started changing. And they said, we want to keep singing with the group. And so they created a new ensemble and they said, okay, Phil, you're going to direct that. And I said, I'm going to what? But I went to work, right? I started reading about voice change, what there was about it. I pulled on my own experience of working with high school singers in the studio, and I went from there, and that was, 18 years ago. Right. So I did not become someone who feels confident in his toolkit overnight in any way, shape, or form. But learning is always happening. The person who we are now is not the person who we're going to be a year from now. And approaching that, accepting that, not with fear, but with hope and with optimism, seeing it as opportunity. I think that's one of the ways that it lets you sleep at night.
Yeah. Yes. That is kind of my total MO. I love learning. This is why I even have the podcast I don't want to be the same person in a year that I am right now. But before we go,
Yeah.
I just want to ask you, because I love international music, and
Okay.
I saw on your bio that you sing Arabic and Indian styles.
All right, now hold on a second. I said that I've collaborated.
Oh, okay.
So here's another example of how life takes you in really, really strange directions. Um, Gosh, it must have been about 10 years ago now. Children's Chorus had an opportunity to do a collaboration with an Egyptian American musician named Simon Shaheen.
Mm.
He plays oud. His father was a very, very respected musician in Egypt, and he has had his career here in the main in the United States. And I fell in love with this music. A lot of the music that we started looking at was composed by a composition team called the Rabhani brothers, who are from Lebanon. And that introduced me to the singing of Feiruz. And it was interesting because, at the time, I was also studying really intensively in a bel canto tradition. Because plan A of being the next Bono wasn't working, I said, well, people do hire 50-year-olds to sing classical music, so maybe I should get my bleep together as a classical singer. And so learning about, just sustain and carriage in the voice, I was kind of doing a lot of listening and cramming of these great bel canto recordings. And then I was starting to listen to someone like Feiruz or a singer who's working now named Rima Kashesh. And I was starting to hear all the things that I was working on in the studio were happening in traditional Arab music.
Huh.
Right. And that really got me thinking about these universal things. Right. There's singing that happens below the style. Right. How do we start? How do we stop? How do we get loud? How do we get quiet? How do we articulate rhythm? How do we sing high? How do we sing low? It manifests itself differently when you listen to, Feiruz, Marcel Khalife, etc., versus when you're listening to someone like Alfredo Kraus. But there is a common root to that tree. And so again, when we take that into the voice studio or into the children's chorus or into the clinic, we can be intimidated by what we don't know on one hand, right? Because I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of musical theater, as some of my colleagues do, but I know who to call, right? And I also know how to listen to some of the sound that's being made under the style, right? Just like you can kind of look at the movement underneath an athletic gesture, right? Football players, baseball players, dancers, there's certain mechanics that underlie those different disciplines, right? But anyway, I got so down that rabbit hole that Kim and I actually wound up doing an Arab music retreat up at Holyoke College for a summer. And for a minute there, I was kind of like, this is what I want to do. Now, it turned out to be a rabbit hole rather than a real change. But and that also then allowed me to start embracing some of like the Northern Indian, the Hindustani, and then the Southern Indian Carnatic traditions as well. But again, more as someone who was a student of it, learning about the stylistic expectations and differences, but then also trying to listen for those commonalities, again, at the base of the tree as I climb up into these different limbs.
Yeah. Oh, I love that so much. I grew
Yeah.
up listening to music from all over the world.
Cool.
And so when everyone else was growing up singing pop music, I played classical French horn, listened to classical music, and
Wonderful.
then listened to world music. And
yeah. But it's really funny because just like we have these conversations of who's the best, right? Like when I was again steeped in opera, was it Tebaldi or was it Callas? When you then go and you talk to Arab musicians talking about great Arab singing, they're like, it's Feiruz. No, it's Kulthum. And like people are ready to fight over it. And it's just, I would just say that like people are moved by different things and excellence comes in all shapes and sizes, right? But how the intersection of excellence and health, are you doing this with your body or at the expense of your body? That's where I found myself kind of living. And I consider myself really, really lucky. It's incredibly challenging. It's intimidating. Sometimes it's heartbreaking. It can sometimes feel like a real slog, but it is kind of funny how I think that all of the things that I've kind of learned along the way I find that they're in a toolkit that when I'm reaching for answers in a room, sometimes I draw from that experience at that Arab music conference. Sometimes I draw from my voice disorders class at Westchester, or conversations that I had with my voice teachers at Penn State and the College of New Jersey, or with my private teacher here in Wilmington, David Christopher, or just things that I've learned from singers that I've observed. We're always learning, and we have to be humble and open to that, I think.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I just heard yesterday, I was out with a wonderful colleague of mine, Aaron Johnson. I hope he doesn't mind that I share this, but he said, I say in every one of my classes, I hope that the research that I'm doing proves me wrong. I don't want to be right about everything that I'm teaching. Mm-hmm. And I just loved when he said that, because exactly what you just said is humbled and always wanting to learn, and always just wanting to be better at what we do and be able to help people to the best of our ability.
Yeah. And that's scary, right? Because they're coming to us for answers sometimes. Mm-hmm. And if we have to, and being honest enough to say, I don't know the answer to that right now, you really do almost feel like you're letting that person down. But I think being that honest down the road pays off, because when you then come back and say, this is the best answer I could find, or we're going to have to find this answer for you together, and there's going to be some trial and error, I think that allows that person again to take that next step on their journey with kind of open eyes and knowing that they're not alone in it. I think that's also a really important part of it.
Yeah. And that's something that we are taught, at least I was taught in my massage training, was that one of the most powerful things that you can tell one of your clients is, I don't know, but I'm willing to look into this, and I'm willing to find someone who does, and to get help.
Right.
And it has been powerful in my experience and in my practice. And another huge thing was with my great mentor, Joan Lader, said to me, I said, there are so many times I just feel like I don't know what I'm doing. And she said, you're in exactly the right spot.
I said the exact same thing to a colleague yesterday. There is not a day that goes by where I don't have a moment of, I don't know what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But again, I think that it's the great challenge of what we do, but then we have to kind of take that breath and say, I'm part of a community where I can reach out. I can text Christine and go, hey, do you know someone who, right? I can look at a couple of books. Like I said, I'm so flattered that I got to talk to you a little bit about the state of where this profession is right now, but I'm doing that standing on the shoulders of a lot of giants who are still working, right? And they thankfully have put some of this to paper and have recorded some of this for posterity. And I think that, treating what we do with a great sense of responsibility and making sure that we are doing the work, so that if we don't have the answer, we don't stop there, but then we say, well, how can I find this answer safely, professionally, ethically? And then we do that work. That's what we're charged to do.
Yeah. Well, Phil, I am so grateful to have you as part of my team and have you as part of my community. And if any of the listeners want to know more about you, if they want to reach out to you, if they want to get in touch with you, what would be the best ways to do that?
Well, I think they can, depending on the hat that they're wearing, if they go to www.wilmingtonchildrenschorus.org, they can find my contact email for me as the choir director or the young vocal mentor hat. If they want to ask some questions of me from the singing voice specialist or speech language pathologist hat, they can reach out to me at pdoucette@phillyent.com. I'm a member of the voice care team at Philadelphia Ear, Nose, and Throat Associates. So that's kind of my work email. And then we can go from there.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Phil, for coming on and having this conversation with me today.
Oh, again, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, tell your colleagues, students, and friends. Subscribe, rate, and please write a review. You can find us on Instagram or Facebook, and feel free to check out my website at www.thevisceralvoice.com for information on programs and upcoming events. I hope you join us next time for another wonderful conversation on the Visceral Voice.